I got married 4 years ago, and shortly after that, about 8 months after that, my husband retired and went into deep depression. And he's still there. It's not as bad as it was in the beginning. I've been listening to your tapes and Abrahaming this situation for all that I'm worth. And I'm still struggling with the line between recognizing his right and power to make decisions for himself and being advised by those who are supposed to know that when you're in depression, you don't make wise decisions. So I don't know how to balance this. I find myself in a caretaker situation much of the time. There are things that he can take that make him feel better, but he often decides they aren't doing him any good, and so he won't take them. And it grieves me to see him in this state.
How long did you know him before he went into depression?
I knew him for about 20 years before we were married, but we were each married to other people. And he was, I understand now that there were times when he had depression, and he told me about that before we got married. But I saw him as a vital, energetic, fun-loving, wonderful guy who cares about other people and is fun to be with.
What did you see? What is your perspective of the relationship that he had with his former mate?
His first wife betrayed him, and they were divorced after a 35-year marriage and adopting 2 children. His second wife died of cancer after they'd been married 4 years.
And did you know him while he was in that relationship?
Both of those relationships, I knew him.
And what did you find his personality to be like? In other words, was he someone that let the other one lead and he followed? Or was he more the leader in the relationship?
I didn't recognize it with the first marriage, but I think he did let his first wife lead a lot, although it wasn't obvious on the surface.
And what about the second?
I didn't know them as well. I think she was a very strong person. I think there was the leading going on there as well.
The reason that we're probing here just a little bit is because, a lot actually, is because you heard us talk earlier about Esther's parents and about relationships and how there is a person and there is a person, but when two come together, they become something that is different than the one and the one. The vibrational dynamics of relationships are very interesting. And so while you made the correlation, or at least it sounded as if you were making the correlation between your husband's withdrawal from work as he retired and is going into this deep depression. And we say, we certainly think that that is a factor, because when you have things that you're focused upon that are calling thoughts through you, it is more likely for you to stay focused upon a productive, good-feeling thought than if you do not have something to focus upon. In other words, when there is something to think about, when you give your attention to something, it is already vibrating, and as you focus upon it, it activates that vibration within you. And so very often, especially in a work environment where there are goals that you're trying to reach and quotas that you're trying to fill and other people that you are working in concert with, very often the work environment itself causes that energy that has been sent out there to call through you, and oftentimes you are carried just by the momentum of the work in which you are involved. It is our feeling from what we are picking up from you that not only is it the withdrawing from that work that has contributed to this depression, but he is in a different relationship. In other words, he is accustomed to the environment that is around him sort of doing the focusing and calling. And now that he is not working, there is nothing that is pulling through him in an obvious way. And your personality is such that you're trying to live and let live a bit more. And so he feels like so many people feel who have been jumping through hoops all of his life, a bit like a puppet that somebody has let go of the strings. And it goes against your natural nature to pick up those strings and start making him move in the way that you want him to, and yet that is in many ways what he is accustomed to. We do not think that you should become the puppeteer. That's not what we're encouraging. And we do not think that it is unusual for him to want a little bit of that. But if we were standing in your physical shoes, just understanding that would make us feel a little bit better. And then we would see him, as we see so many people, who is in a new environment where he is giving birth to new and different rockets of desires that he has ever given birth to before. In other words, when you are bored, you want some stimulation. And whether he's admitting it or not, that is going into his vibrational escrow. When you're depressed, you want to feel better. And whether he's able to admit that or not, it is going into vibrational escrow. So what we're wanting you to hear from us is that even though he looks complacent and even though it looks as if he is withdrawing from life, because it is not his nature and it is certainly not time for him to withdraw from life, what's really happening without you knowing it and certainly without him knowing it, but we certainly can see it, he is contributing in a stronger way than usual to his vibrational escrow. In other words, that energy of his life is beginning to gain some momentum again. And if you can see him in your mind's eye as someone who eventually will begin to pick up the rhythm again. In other words, don't look at him in a comparative way of how he once was and how he now is and feel your personal depression over that, because what happens, it just compounds it. In other words, the work that you must do is you must continue to see him as you once knew him to be and say to yourself things like, not to him, but to yourself, things like, he'll bounce back. He's in the process of bouncing back. He's coming back into alignment with who he is. He's just gaining a new foothold. He's had several big changes in his life in a short period of time, and he doesn't adapt very well to changes, and that's not a problem because most people don't really adapt well to changes, but he's coming back into alignment. And what will begin to happen, because we can feel that you are often in alignment and you are almost at the point where you are wondering if you can maintain your alignment under these conditions. And we say, not only can you, but we can feel very powerfully that you want to. You can maintain your alignment under these conditions. And as you do, you will see that he will start swinging back into alignment also. The most important thing that we want to give you about this is that there's nothing wrong with where he is. And that's the most important thing that you have to know and then eventually convey. And we don't mean convey verbally or even through body language. We mean when you know it, you cannot help but convey it. When you disapprove of how someone feels or how they're behaving, not only does your attention to that disconnect you, which makes you resent him, which is why you sort of want him to get this show back on the road, but then you are a catalyst. It's sort of like you just keep bouncing off one another in this vibration that is not natural to either one of you. So now let's back up and talk about this from another perspective. Many people, when they are depressed, move naturally and readily, usually quickly, into some form of anger, differing degrees of anger. Unless you've been taught about the inappropriateness of that, in which case you just don't let yourself go there. Which means you hold yourself unnaturally in depression longer. So what we'd like you to do is start picking some fights. Well, we're not really kidding. What we would like you to do is understand that it's natural that he begins moving through that. In other words, it's from depression, there are some steps that you want to take or that you need to take before you get back into that place of feeling good.
I've been worrying about that.
And so, well, the question that we want to ask, and we had a discussion about it a bit earlier, is his medication making him incapable of making that jump? Is it diffusing his focus to the degree that he is not stepping into that improved state of being? And so if we were standing in your physical shoes, we would begin playfully saying to him, you know, I've been thinking about picking a fight with you because it seems that if I could make you mad, you'd feel better. And just see what he says. Just see what he says. Okay. Say to him, I'm beginning to realize that when we feel powerless, and speak in terms of you, not him. In other words, don't project, don't come off with him as if you've got him all psychoanalyzed and you've figured out where he is. Well, maybe you should do that. That will annoy him. Say to him that you recognize that when you're feeling this depression, that it is a perception of loss of power, and that you understand that that's a very common thing when someone retires and when someone experiences the changes in life that he has been experiencing. And then say to him that you've been hearing, because you have, certainly, that the next logical step in feeling better is to move into that place where you're getting some of your power back, and then see if you can't encourage him into some dialogue that helps him explain to you what it is that he's feeling. We do not believe that in any way he will begin to direct that anger at you. But as he begins to speak about it, as you watch him become more enlivened as he begins to speak about it, say to him, this is some of what I'm wanting to hear from you, because I believe with all my heart that this is a step in the right direction. And once you get him talking, and it might take a week or two to get him to open up and begin talking. Once you get him talking, it's going to get worse before it gets better, because at first he's going to be reluctant to talk, and then he's going to begin to talk, and then he's going to get rolling on it. So just get yourself ready and lie on your bed at night and smile as you think about how you are encouraging him right up that emotional scale. You're like the call of source, calling him into that place of more life, you see. And then as you notice that he's getting angry, and then you're beginning to talk to him in terms of finding things that are a little less angry, then you can begin, once you are able to move him from depression into anger. We don't think that there will be any problem with revenge or rage. After you move him into that place of anger and frustration, now you can begin to playfully let him know what you have been knowing all along, which is that was just necessary therapy for him to get back into the place that is naturally him. And it is our expectation that he will again return to that playful, light-hearted being that you have known him to be. This is a very temporary situation for him, very unnatural. He's just feeling a little bit lost right now, and you can guide him back into the light. And we want to say to you, his inner being is calling him, but he can't hear it because he's taking drugs.
Would you advise me to encourage him to stop seeing the psychiatrist and stop taking the drugs? What should I do about that, if anything?
We wouldn't encourage that in the beginning. Instead, we would encourage this conversation that we're talking about here. And it is our expectation that he'll get feeling so much better that he'll make that decision on his own. We are not encouraging that he stop taking the drug. Our conversation is not about his action. We are encouraging you to entice him up the emotional scale. And you see, we know that, this is a continuation of the discussion that we had earlier. You don't have to stop taking the drug to move up the emotional scale. But especially when there's someone close by, like a psychiatrist or like a loving mate, who understands the motion up the emotional scale. In other words, you're sort of like the satellite dish that is beaming source energy in and sort of spoon-feeding him up the emotional scale. He can see you and hear you. You can guide him, especially when you know what you're doing. So the first thing that you want to do is paint a picture in your mind of who he really is and get that image really activated. It has been activated within you more dominantly than this other. Even though it's been quite a while that you've been in this depression with him, it is still not the most dominant vibration within you. We can feel who you see him as. It's still very active within you. And so the first thing you want to do is reactivate that. And then just enter into some of these discussions and just tell him what you know about depression and about the emotional guidance scale. And give him the benefit of the doubt. Let him know that you understand why it would be happening to him and that it is certainly not a failure on his part or on anybody's part for that matter, you see. And then as he begins to feel better, he will begin saying things like, maybe what he's been doing with the other is counterproductive. And then you can begin saying to him, well, I think you're wise enough to know. In other words, this has to be your decision. In other words, you're wanting to put the power back in his hands immediately. Right now, he doesn't feel the power to quit. He doesn't feel the power to walk away from that. In other words, how powerless is that, to believe that you need something that you don't really want? That really is the epitome of powerlessness, you see. And so we don't want you to be the one that takes that power. We want you to be the one that guides him back into his own power.
Thank you.